Hi, folks. I'm Dan Schell, the Chief Editor for Clinical Leader. I'm going to be your moderator today for the Identifying the Pain Points that Stop Sponsors and CROs from Working with Sites. We have a great panel today, but right now I'm going to turn it over to Jim Cremidas, who is the Executive Director of the AMRC. First, Jim.
Thanks, Dan. I just wanted to give a quick welcome to everybody. We appreciate you taking the time to talk about this important topic. In particular, want to thank our esteemed panelists, Karen, Carlos, and Adam. And Dan, thank you for moderating this session. You know, we hope that the attendees, those of you who are watching the program here, will send in your questions and comments as we go through. As I mentioned, this is an important topic, understanding why some organizations will or will not work with certain sites. And I think it's going to be quite enlightening to hear the different perspectives. We have CRO representation, investigator site representation, as well as sponsor representation. So thanks again, everybody, and please do send in those questions and comments. And Dan, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. Yeah, you know what? Let me introduce each one of the panelists real quick, just so you know who's who. We've got Carlos Orantes from Alcanza, Adam Kinsey from Merck, Karen McIntyre from Parexel, and Jim is on there also. We are going to jump right into some of these questions right off the bat here. So first of all, we've talked about this network advantage. So how would you define the network advantage from your organization's perspective? And that question is for any of you. I'll pick on Adam. Adam, can you get us started?
Sure thing, Dan. Yeah, I mean, when I think of the network advantage, I really think of a couple of different things. One is the ability to run your trials at scale, right? I mean, networks often come with a number of locations, all under a single operating model. You tend to have quicker cycle times with startup, where you can have a number of sites that get up and running at any given time. I think the second thing I would say is that, you know, it's often helpful to both sponsors and I think CROs when you're new to a therapy area and you need to conduct trials of a certain scale. You know, it's very difficult to enter those spaces by yourself. So I think partnering with networks can be really important to access patient populations that you just, and physicians, et cetera, that you weren't used to interacting with. So I'd say those are the two biggest things I think of. The third, I guess I would add a third thing, and that's just this sort of centralized structure there. So you're kind of dealing with not only individual sites, but you're dealing with hopefully a central infrastructure that can have some level of quality oversight and troubleshooting centralization that can be more efficient for sponsors to deal with.
Karen, I'm guessing that a lot of those are similar for the CRO. Any specifics about the network advantage from your vantage point?
Yes, so no, absolutely agree with Adam. And I will come back to the centralized infrastructure because I think that really is critically important. If you have a centralized infrastructure and you're dealing with one person, so we're talking about performance, we're talking about payments, we're talking about budget, we're talking about timelines, and that's cascaded to the sites from one source and it's consistent and everybody's hearing the right information. I think that is really powerful, and also the ability to scale up very quickly. I think that we will come to a time where we're less concerned about the number of patients recruited at each of those individual sites from a multi-site network, rather than the network in general.
Carlos, I intentionally chose you for last because I imagine you're going to have a strong opinion on this. What do you got?
Well, first of all, I couldn't agree more with both Adam and Karen. So they hit a lot of the key spots, you know, about communication, scale, the ability to start up studies faster, to focus on enrollment. I think the overarching theme here is, you know, being able to do more and faster, but also in a controlled fashion and in a partnership kind of way between all the parties involved, because we have a lot of parties in every single one of these trials. And I think the more scale that you can have with fewer parties, I think it just becomes easier to activate, execute, and then really do what we're all trying to do collectively, which is to get the drug approved and to the patients faster. So that's what's exciting for us as a multi-site network, and part of AMRC is to be able to really leverage that with all of the partners that we have around the table.
You know, the whole concept of MCRCs, we're going to talk about that today, this philosophical dilemmas and mindsets around that. This next question, this is for you, Adam, and you, Karen. So do you think that MCRCs challenge a long-held mindset that sponsors must retain control over every trial detail?
Maybe I'll start, Karen, since it says sponsors in the question, and then maybe you can respond. Yeah, I guess I would say, Dan, that it's more than a mindset, I suppose. I mean, it's really driven by good clinical practice, which, we are responsible for every trial detail in a sense, and the oversight thereof. Now, we can certainly delegate those responsibilities, and we have to do that, officially and in writing, et cetera. But even when it comes to selection of investigators and institutions, it's right there in bold print in ICH GCP that the sponsor is responsible for that, right? So it becomes, I think Carlos touched on it, it becomes one of, how do you partner with an organization to sort of have a collective way that you manage the control, right? So I would say, from my perspective of Merck, we're not comfortable giving up that control. We could share that control with an important partner where we're working together. So, yeah, but I do think there is maybe an aspect of this that's kind of held on to, and there's a little bit of inertia in sort of wanting to give up some of the old ways of working when it comes to traditional site identification and selection, and maybe, worry that if you quote unquote put all your eggs in one basket, that's maybe
Right.
leading to some vulnerability. Trials are big investments, so it's often a difficult platform with which to try out new things. So that's really, I think, a contributing factor to some of that inertia. But I do agree with what Karen said. I do think we're on the verge of seeing some change in that regard and having a different way of working.
Yeah, again, so I think that whole point about control is really critically important. There is got to be an element of that, because ultimately, to Adam's point, the regulations dictate that the sponsor is responsible for the study. I also think that we're seeing improvements, though. I think that we're seeing some of these larger networks building really strong relationships directly with the sponsor, with agreeing some of those responsibilities and oversight. And I do see that confidence is growing. I still think that there's a long way to go. I have heard, don't want to put all my eggs in the one basket, time and time again. And I think that there's layers here. So I do think when we speak to sponsors and we talk about the multi-site network concept, everybody agrees that it should have efficiencies. It should be faster through study contract. If we're contracting one contracting budget over multiple sites, that all makes a lot of sense. When it comes down to the project teams, it's their responsibility to deliver that study. And this is the way they've normally delivered it. There's a bit of bias for both sponsor and CROs to go back to the same sites to do things the same way. But I definitely do feel optimistic. I do think that we're making some moves in the right direction.
Dan, can I make a quick comment?
Yeah, jump in. Yeah, anytime.
It just made me remember, and I'm going to date myself here, but when I was at Lilly and we first set up strategic relationships with 3 CROs, it was Quintiles at the time, Parexel, and one other. Even though we had really good management processes in place, it was very difficult for the study teams to delegate responsibilities and actions to the CRO. Now, over time, that improved dramatically once the CRO kind of proved themselves, if you will, but it took a long time for people to feel comfortable. So I think the point that both Karen and Adam are making is this industry goes through change very slowly for a lot of good reasons, because we want patient safety and we want to be careful. And there's huge investments from the sponsors and the CROs involved. But I think the time has arrived where we can more vertically integrate, if you will. In a sense, when we did this years ago, the sponsors and the CROs became what I would call more vertically integrated through specific strategic relationships. And I think now is the time that we can start doing that with sites as well.
Yeah, it's definitely an industry that is not we don't adopt new things quickly, right? With MCRCs, are they being overlooked by sponsors and CROs just because it's something new? Or Adam, anyone really, any feelings on that? Or is this just the new way of doing things? And so we're looking at it a little bit more,
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah, Dan, I don't think overlooked is the right term. I mean, we
All right.
certainly use the MCRCs a lot. I think it's
Yeah.
one in which we're maybe not at the optimal use, right? So we're using them more transactionally and really kind of fitting them into an old way of working as opposed to taking that leap and really thinking more strategically and kind of in a partnership more long term, right? So I see that, it's definitely, as I think we've all been saying, we're on a certain arc here, in my view. From the kind of traditional way of selecting individual sites, and maybe some of those individual sites were part of networks, to taking a different approach where you have, longer term programmatic as well as kind of strategic relationships with large networks that can, deliver, can make the investments to deliver populations of patients and clinical trial participants, over a longer period of time and at scale.
Yeah, I agree. My observation is this is not a new way of doing things. It's a
Right.
different way of doing things, but multi-site networks have been around for a long time. And they make a ton of sense, because when we think back to what our pipelines looked like 15, 20 years ago, we're seeing a lot more of research being conducted in the community rather than the large academic institutions, which were the go-to sites in the distant past. And so I've certainly been working with site networks. In fact, my very first role in 1992 in this industry was as a study coordinator in a site network of multiple sites. So I don't think it's new, but I think that site networks, especially with the coming together of AMRC, are saying, look, we really could be working much more effectively together. My observation is that we are seeing that sponsors are very happy to work with site networks, but maybe a little hesitant about the number of patients or number of sites per study. And I think if we see that growth, then we're going to see much more of the efficiencies across cost effectiveness, across diverse patient access, across efficiency and speed at study startup. So I think that we're on the journey. We're just not where we really need to be yet.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, site networks, like you said, have been around for a long time. Large site networks have been around for a long time. Carlos, they're obviously, and this might be a question for Carlos and Jim. Obviously, there is still some misunderstanding, right? I mean, with the rise of site networks over the past 2 years, there's a lot of questions that arise, I imagine, out of it. You kind of alluded to this earlier, where you're not saying, hey, we're just going to use this site network and solve all of our site selection problems. Carlos, what do you believe sponsors and CROs misunderstand the most about the value MCRCs bring?
So I think, Dan, first, the value, I think, is clear, the ability to do more faster, potentially, with
Right.
less number of parties involved. There is a perception of risk, but I think the biggest, I'll say, challenge that we're overcoming as an industry is moving along at different paces at different sponsors. As Adam alluded to, you're trying different things. I mean, we're going from an industry that was one CDA for every single site, for every single study, to one budget and contract. Little by little, some sponsors have moved to a master CDA, a master, MSA. And so it's gonna take some time. But I can tell you that there is a clear difference in how far ahead some sponsors are. And I'll give a specific anecdote, no names mentioned, but us and another AMRC network and us and a separate AMRC network have run recently a program with a sponsor where we were given I'll say, the empowerment, right, to select our sites? And to some extent, what is the allocation of patients that makes sense to Karen's point too, right? We took on that risk. We got that process done extremely fast. So we got the study started faster. One of them finished enrollment 3 weeks faster than expected, and the other one 3.5 weeks. Now, there was a CRO involved as well, but they were involved in certain things. And so I think it's the sponsors navigating what are they comfortable with. And this was somewhat of a pilot. And so what we see is as we see more and more of these pilots, the sponsors are navigating this and CROs are navigating this, there's going to be more proliferation of these practices. And eventually, what we hope maybe in our lifetime is that we get to a new way of doing things. And also the whole concept of what is a site? What is a multi-site network? We still hear the term SMO. It makes me like cringe. No. So we're involved in a whole initiative on what is the site taxonomy. Adam's deeply involved in that. AMRC is going to help drive a little more of that, because there are so many nuances out there that not all sites are created equal, not all site networks are created equal. So as everybody's saying on this panel, it's evolving. We still have some work to do, but I think what's great is that the collaboration and the communication is happening, and it needs to continue about what's working, what's not working, so we can collectively get us there.
Yeah, to me, it seems like one of the questions I hear a lot when they talk about large site networks, and it was a question that Jim, when you were on with Brad Hightower on his podcast, I think he brought up, like, is this or MCRCs a structural challenge to traditional CRO business models, or is there a room for partnership? Like, how are those going to be evolving? Carlos, you kind of alluded to that, like there's still ways that we can partner together, right? I mean, what do you hear about that?
Well,
So yeah,
go ahead, Carlos. Sorry.
I'm sorry. That was for Jim? Never mind. Go ahead.
No, I'll give it to either one of you. I imagine you both can comment on that one.
Well, there is opportunity for partnership, and I think the key is early conversation, communication about what are the goals and objectives, and we should all be around the table. Sponsors, sites, CROs, and technology partners. Those are the 4 legs to the stool to properly execute a program and do it faster and better and in compliance. So I think there's going to be different types of programs, challenges, whether it's an early phase, later phase study, and depending on the therapeutic area, I just think there needs to be more collaboration up front to determine what can and can't be done. And we should look to doing this, even if it's customized for every single project a little bit differently, until we get into our mojo. We're not there.
Yeah, and my comment on that, Dan, as I mentioned on that previous program, was I think there's always going to be a role for CROs.
Yeah.
And if you look at the evolution of CROs in the last 30 years, things have changed a lot. Some of them got very heavily into technology. By the way, congratulations, Karen, on the award you won for through CenterWatch on that, just recently announced. But in addition to technology, I mean, things like functional outsourcing that didn't exist 30 years ago. So I think there's always going to be some type of role for a CRO for oversight where the sponsor can't provide 100% of that. So I'm not worried about that at all. In fact, I think the MCRCs are also going to evolve over time.
Sure.
And frankly, and I kind of hope this is the case. I mentioned vertical integration earlier. I would love to see a time or a study where, as Carlos said, there's the sponsor, the CRO, the site network, technology, and maybe even some patients involved in the design of the protocol, so that we have something that literally from start to finish just flows. And I hate to use manufacturing, but if you look at the, how cars are made or some type of complex machinery, humans are not machines. That's, taken for granted, and we're all different and everything. But we certainly could be much more efficient from a industrial perspective than we currently are today. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that's where I see the vertical integration is sort of the answer in the future to streamline operations, faster delivery of therapies to patients and providers.
Okay. So the title of this webinar has identifying the pain points in it. So let's talk about pain points for a second. Think about, this is for all the panelists. Give me your top 3 hurdles, challenges, pain points, whatever you want to call them. What are the things that cause problems when it comes to this sponsor CRO relationships with sites these days? Is it data standards, contracting timelines, technology, fragmentation? We hear that a lot. Adam, do you have any that you can throw out there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think some of the things you said come into play
Yeah.
in different situations, certainly. But, I would say from my perspective, we are a kind of a show me the money kind of business. We want, we want first and foremost top quality. Our job as a sponsor, at least in my part of the organization, is to ensure patients are being treated safely, ethically, right? And that the data that are being collected are valid and can be verified through source documentation, et cetera. So that's kind of the grounding that we have with everything. But then beyond that, it becomes very important from a business standpoint outside of GCP that we have a level of kind of predictable performance, right? That when we go to a site or we go to a network and we say, how can you deliver on this project that we're giving you? And they say we can do X amount in X time frame. If someone can deliver on that and do that time and time again, we're going to keep coming to that well. So I think it's when first and foremost that first part breaks down where we start to see poor quality and poor oversight and veering into some compliance concerns, like those are the first tensions that come in, right? First and foremost, right? Then of course, if that's there, then we have issues where if we're not getting, we're not getting the performance and we're having to go to backup sites and we're having to do this or that. I mean, those kinds of things, I wouldn't say we're kind of a one and done when it comes to that. I mean, we certainly understand sometimes there are challenges that we give to sites that are difficult for them to overcome. But I think if we have that good engagement and good communication to work through problems, we'll go back to sites. But I think it's those kinds of, the raw performance from a quality and quantity perspective is what we're looking for as a sponsor.
Got it. Karen?
Yeah, so I also think that we have to really think about, so the biggest issue for me, the pain points for me in the CRO space is really the communication about how these large multi-site networks can perform, how they can work, and making sure that our sponsors and our internal teams understand the capabilities and capacities of these networks. Where is their strengths in terms of their therapeutic focus areas, demonstrating their proven performance of deliverables. And that doesn't need to be exceeding and hitting out the park. That's just consistent deliverables throughout the clinical trials process and their stories. We have a kind of highlight series where we invite the site networks to come and speak to our cross-department teams, like our strategic and clinical feasibility teams, like our medical services franchise, like our integrated strategy teams, and to make sure that they are really aware that these networks are out there, this is what they can do, this is how they perform. And I'm calling this as one of the pain points because to begin with, it was a little bit like nobody no-show. And now as words got around and have you heard what CANS is doing? Have you heard about the coalition of these networks? And people are interested, and we're now seeing somewhere in the region of 60 to 100 folks turn up across these departments to listen and realize what these sites can do. I really like what you're saying, Adam, because the truth is that we have a tendency to go back to the sites that are performing for us time and time again. But I do think we have to also be thinking about these sites of the future as part of the networks or as independent research sites, because these sites are really struggling to get an opportunity on the ladder. So I think as part of this strategy, we look for how we're going to deliver our first patients in, how we're going to find a patient population, make sure that these sites will get the data we need when we need it. But in the background, thinking about a small percentage of these sites as emerging sites so that we're ready for the future.
Okay.
Yeah, let me add something, Dan. Great point, Karen, because I would agree the pie is growing rapidly. So the number of trials is on the exponential part of the curve. And so I totally agree with the point that there is a flaw in returning, even if you've had that consistency, that well is going to run dry. So to use my own analogy from before. So I do think we have almost a responsibility as sponsors and CROs to kind of grow the community of sites that can do clinical trials and want to, and to reach different communities. So it's a great point, that we almost have an obligation on every trial to sort of add an element of newness to it, new naive sites to us as a sponsor, or even some cases, newer investigators, as long as there's the right mentoring type of relationship, and which I think you get with potentially with MCRCs, maybe more than a standalone, right? Because they're going to have experienced investigators that can do that kind of hand holding and mentoring.
Just a
Carlos?
final point. So we
sorry.
did launch a scholarship program for emerging sites in 2024, and the majority, and it's supported by established sites that are helping mentor these new scholarship sites. And the majority of the established mentors actually are site representatives from the large multi-site networks. Just wanted to raise that. So definitely paying back.
And where can folks find information about that?
When where can I put it into the clinical leader? What would be the? Let me get the link and I'll put it into the chat.
Yeah, that's fine. Like afterwards, that's what I was going to say. Yeah, afterwards, keep in mind, if you are watching this, you'll be able to watch this on demand on the AMRC website, but we'll find out more information about some of this also. We can push that out. Also, some of you have already found the Q&A function. Great. Keep sending those questions in. Carlos, any top three or any comments you want to have on this question too?
Sure. You all knew me that I can't keep my my comments to myself. So absolutely. I think the first thing I want to just reiterate what both Karen and Adam have said. We all have a responsibility to keep raising or lifting the tide. Rising tides lift all boats, companies and people. So I really want to say that so it resonates. So it's both multi-site research corporations as well as single-site corporations. I think for me, the pain points that I hear from our company, our peers in the industry is first of all, is still getting a study started. The startup process of a study is very reactive, and it's very much site by site focused, more so than multi-site focused. When I say reactive is we start talking about a study very much in detail, and the sites are not brought into it until the very end before the study starts, as opposed to being brought in much earlier. We're having a discussion with a sponsor who actually wants to talk about the patient populations that they're going to need a year from now. Think about that, as opposed to let's fill out a feasibility, or let's have a PSV for a study that's starting sooner, an SIV for a study that's starting tomorrow. That type of planning is exactly what we need. We said it earlier, bring us in early, all of us around the table. So study startup is one pain point. Karen alluded to the communication part. We can have, and I know Adam said this is one of the advantages, having a central infrastructure at a multi-site company. It doesn't matter if we have that, for example, but it's not mirrored. And we're talking to different people at CROs or sponsors, right? So we have to, once again, make sure that it mirrors across the board, because then, for example, we have a single point of contact, but they're talking to 5 to 10 to 15, 20 people at the CRO or the sponsor for the same study. And guess what? Unfortunately, not everybody aligns, right? Information flow is really a challenge in any organization. So I would say those are my top two. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I think if we would spend more time planning up front, I think the execution, the quality, and the patient experience would be given a lot more more focus, right? So we talk a lot about all those, but what about patient experience for retention, completion with quality? I know Adam hit on those, but we're not focusing on that because we're very reactive as an industry to all the other things, that if we don't do, it doesn't matter because the study's not going to get started or we're not going to have enrollment.
Got it. Let me stay on you for a moment, Carlos. MCRCs, too many acronyms. Sorry. Where are MCRCs forced to conform unnecessarily, and how does that affect staff satisfaction, retention, trial performance, any of those things?
So I think that we mentioned, I didn't do a third pain point, but I'm going to bring it in here because I think this is where conforming to processes that were thought about and established and finalized before they came to the site, as well as systems. I just came from SCRS West Technology Partner Conference, and it's all of the different systems that exist, the interoperability of those systems. Same thing with processes. So we as an organization and our peers in the industry, and even single sites, right? We all spend time developing our processes, fine tune them. And unfortunately, when we have to shift gears and ask our team, pivot and do it this way, do it that way, it just introduces a lot of variability, which introduces risk of not performing. And so I think that is one, the process and the systems, in addition to the other pain points. So that, to me, we're going to have to figure out how do we evolve, where if we make an investment as a site in people, process, and technology systems, we need to be given the chance to actually leverage them to deliver on our commitments to our sponsors and CROs.
There's a lot of questions about AMRC in general, and real quick, explain the difference between SCRS and, say, ACRO, and the relationships. I've heard you give this explanation before, and I think it ties into this conversation too, because each organization is doing different things for the industry. Can you just touch upon that real fast?
Sure. Well, let's start with ACRO. ACRO represents CROs.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because they're a trade association which started, I want to say 20, 25 years ago, when CROs were first sort of still evolving, early on in their evolution, maybe I should say, or earlier on. And I talked with their executive director, Doug Petticord, and what he explained to me was when they first started, the whole idea was to try to help raise awareness in the industry of the value that CROs can bring relative to the way they were perceived. And they've been very successful, I would say. SCRS, actually, it's interesting, they sort of evolved out of ACRP. One of their board members split off and started SCRS. And their whole goal is to represent sites, whether they be networks or MCRCs or whatever, single sites, from a standpoint of the business operations and the relationship of working with sponsors as it relates to contracting, reimbursement, timelines, et cetera. Things that are really more what I think of as the business side of the equation in the relationship. They've done a great job too, in my opinion. Whereas our group, AMRC, first of all, we're focused on multi-site corporations, and that's a key word. These are companies that own the sites. The employees are hired, trained, and developed as well as managed by these corporations. So that's what we see as part of the advantage. Our goal is to try to help people understand, similar to what ACRO did 20, 25 years ago, help people understand the value that these type of corporations can bring to the industry as it relates to drug development or device development. And frankly, you were asking about the pain points. One of the pain points I find really interesting, or at least I think is something that needs a lot of work, is this whole paradigm shift of, instead of signing individual sites one by one like we've done historically as your default, the default should be I go to my networks or my MCRCs where I have a strategic relationship. I work with them first, get a contract signed for X number of patients, X number of sites. Maybe I do that with 2 or 3 of these strategic partners. Then I fill in the one-offs that I need. Maybe you need some academic sites, maybe you need some sites in certain areas where the MCRCs aren't present. So it's a different way of doing site selection than what we've done historically. To me, that's a major objective of what we're trying to achieve, is to change that workflow process, if you will. Now, the other thing that we're doing along with that is we're also getting involved in understanding what's going on from a governmental and regulatory perspective. So things like comments on FDA documents so that they're asking for comments on, tracking what the FDA is thinking. You know, they've got their new AI thing coming out, for example. Tracking what's going on from a legislative perspective, you know, some of the things going on with most favored nations and other types of cost constraints for pharma companies or revenue constraints are going to have an impact. So we're starting to think about, you know, how do we get engaged with pharma, bio, ACRO, some of the other organizations that lobby and support their efforts where it makes sense.
Perfect. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure the audience had that clarification, because I know that's a common question people ask. We've talked about the pain points, we've talked about the challenges and things like that. This is for all of you, actually. Have you seen an example where collaboration with MCRCs has broken through, you know, some of these traditional challenges? So we're looking for real life examples. Who can lead us off with that?
Yeah, I'm happy. Sorry, Carlos, would you
Go
want
for
to?
it. No, go for it, Karen.
So we have definitely seen some great examples of success working with MCRCs, for sure. And that's where it works, when everybody understands the purpose of working with MCRCs. So an example of that is large study where the majority of the patient population are in the community, and where there has been a really healthy study startup process starting actually before the study even begins. And that usually works really much better when, and you know, I was saying that you've already been involved in some of these discussions, but where we do have site representation, where we do have third-party vendors, where we have the patient voice at the table, and everybody really understands what their roles and responsibilities are. And we have, through that process, recruited significant number of patients that if somebody had said to me, this is a plan 10 years ago or 15 years ago, I would have said, oh my goodness, that's a wonderful dream. And we have seen it happen. This system does work. And I think where we are just now is just to your point, Jim, it's about everybody trusting in it, and it's nothing to be afraid of. There is a need for all site models. We need academic institutions for patients with complex medical conditions. We need the multi-site networks that are across MCRCs, and we need dedicated research sites. But when it works phenomenally well, and we've seen that happen.
So Dan, I was going to mention the example I gave earlier. And so our 2 colleagues from AMRC is AMR and Velocity. There are other peers who participated in this, and we'll be putting together a white paper on this to really highlight and celebrate, you know, some of these wins. So we got going faster, right? We finished enrollment faster. And one of the things that I enjoy most is the partnership too that we're developing. We met with the sponsor to review lessons learned right after FPI, first patient in, and see how enrollment was going. Next week, we're going to have a lessons learned session with our site leader, PI, and lead CRC from every site participating in that. So again, we can continue to improve on the process. So it's a partnership, you know, throughout this process that I think it's going to develop into bigger programs with this sponsor. We've shared details of this experience with other sponsors, and one invited us to do a meeting with, I think it was about 40 some odd people within that sponsor organization, because they were all eager to learn what is this? How does it work? What doesn't work? And then I shared earlier that we're in discussions with another sponsor who wants to start planning a year in advance of patient needs. So these are three real examples that I believe others in our industry have much to share as well. And I think we need to make sure that we talk about both things, the wins of what works, and also be candid about what's not working so we can address it instead of just sweeping it under the table and saying, well, we'll just keep working at it. We need to be very transparent and collaborative in this process.
We got about 5 minutes until we're
Yeah.
going to jump into some of the Q&A. Adam, what else can you tell us a little
Well,
bit?
Dan, I'll just be brief. I
No,
totally
you're
agree
fine.
with what Karen and Carlos have said. I would say the quantitative advantage that we talked about at the beginning, just being able to scale up, go fast. But we have a clinical site partnership program, and we have an MCRC that's a part of that program. And what that's unlocked for us is some of the stuff that Carlos spoke to. We have dedicated resources that are a conduit between us, so there is a single point of contact. It allows us to not only work through troubleshooting protocol and program issues around, let's say, retention or recruitment at scale, right? But also to use the network to test out different things that we might want to try, like new technologies. Like before we launch something that's a fix that the sites didn't want, we can test it out. We can have them even participate in user acceptance training and give us their thoughts on a different electronic data capture system that we're thinking about using, or things like that. So I think it really unlocks some of those feedback loops that you can really make sure that anything that you're doing is going to be as friendly as it can be to the end users, which in many cases are our sites. And you can again do that at scale, as opposed to having to try to reach a dozen sites on your own to get a wide spectrum of opinion. You can go to one outfit and get those thoughts.
I love that concept of a feedback loop. Everything we've been talking about, so much of it relies on better communication. Is there one thing, one overlooked enabler that we should all be talking more about when we're talking about MCRCs? Is it the centralized contracting, shared tech layers? What?
I think that we should probably focus on what's easiest, and centralized CDAs and contracting. I'm not a lawyer, so I say that's the easiest, right? But I think if we can start with that we will absolutely chip away
Yeah.
on unnecessary wasted time on the study startup. So there's a lot of initiatives going on to do that. Adam and I are on one of those initiatives with several other sponsor CROs and site network organizations. So we're working that through Advara. And there's other initiatives going around the industry. So we all have the same end goal in mind, is how do we work together better, faster?
Yeah, I would say it's just taking that leap. And I think you've heard some really great examples of when sponsors and CROs did put in this kind of integrated relationship, right? And there's a collaborative approach that's taken to figuring out the needs of the program, ideally with a little bit of runway that the MCRC can kind of look at their population and where they have gaps and really work collaboratively, right, to identify where the site should be placed for a given study or program. I think there is a little bit of leap that I would say sponsors have to take to give up some of that control you had in one of your earlier questions, Dan. And again, I wouldn't say it's giving up the control, but it's sort of sharing the decision rights with a partner, right? So that you're not kind of going to somebody and saying, hey, we want to use you, but we're going to tell you where to put the study, and then when it doesn't work, we're going to be upset with you. I think it's just more recognizing that the networks know their sites and where they can be successful best. And I think the more you take that leap, the more I think you're going to see the benefit.
Let's jump into some of the Q&A because we do have a few questions that have come in, and I want to get to as many of them as we can. Carlos, there's a specific question for you. It says, from your perspective of leading a site network, what are the top 1 or 2 things sponsors or CROs could do differently during feasibility or study startup that would make collaboration more efficient and less reactive for sites?
So that's a great question. Whoever submitted it, thank you for that. So on the feasibility process, I think it's still very antiquated and stale data. And so I think we go through different timelines of feasibility. Sometimes it's pre-award with a CRO, and obviously with a sponsor's different timeline. And there's a lot of evolution that's taking place, scaling up, improving the sites, et cetera. And I think it's really hard, once again, when we're going through a feasibility process, for somebody else to choose our sites and which sites are better for what, as Adam just talked about, to condense it into sometimes truncated fields, and then have somebody else read that, digest it, and make the decision on our behalf that we will later be held accountable to perform. So that process needs to change to be more of, this is what we need, number of patients, and we want it to be in 10, 20 sites, for example, and we get to choose, and we'll be held accountable. And we're okay with that accountability as long as we are giving the empowerment. I'll use that word instead of losing control. I want the sites to be empowered by sponsors and CROs to choose where they can execute. So that's on feasibility. I think on study startup, the other process there is, let's first separate administrative aspects, CDAs, CTAs, budgets, and let's get those to be, if it's repetitive, I'm not joking when I tell you that when we have multiple sites on a single project, sometimes we're still dealing with different people on the other end to negotiate those. And it doesn't make sense. We lose the ability to leverage same terms and budget amounts across multiple sites. So let's look at, if you are dealing with a multi-site corporation, let's go a different route. If it's a single site, it doesn't matter, right? So but I want to make sure that those are two facets that if we can change, we can actually change today. The planning a year out, that's a little longer term, for example, the example I gave earlier. But these are things right in front of us that we could tackle, and but we need to do it faster.
That question was from Bhaskar, and I hope I didn't just butcher your first name. There are a few questions in the Q&A about research naive PIs, and there's obviously a few in here relating to AI. There's one in here from Hugo that says, how important is it for sponsors or CROs for sites to be leveraging AI tools to be more proficient and effective? Karen, any comments from a CRO perspective on that one?
Yeah, so I think that we're just learning, but I think what we do know for sure now is it's not going away. We're talking about it every single day, but we also have to make sure that both from a CRO sponsor and site perspective is that we're safe, that we're comfortable with the artificial intelligence tools that we're using. It is really such a current topic that at the SCRS Global Symposium in September, we do have a workshop with our very clever data and tech team that are going to be coming and speaking to sites about artificial intelligence and what that means for sites. For me, who was about to remember in 1992 as a study coordinator, my biggest personal piece was to take that leap of faith, to not be afraid that it's not a big scary monster. And I am really engaging now with AI tools. I'm finding that they help improve my workload and that. So I can't offer specific tools, but I can say that I think that this is the direction that we're heading in. I'm hoping that we see less complex clinical trial protocols, because we'll learn from the data sets we had in the past what was valuable and what procedures we maybe didn't need to be performing. But I'm excited to see where this journey takes us.
Yeah, Dan, let me comment on that a little bit, give some thoughts. So yeah, I guess I would take that back a little bit and just say that it's really important, in my view, for sites to be taking more data-driven approaches. And I think multi-site research corporations have the ability to interrogate a lot of data and to be able to, whether that's done through AI or other means. I think that it is a really important way that we kind of get away from the traditional site feasibility and selection processes where it's questionnaire based and somebody throws out a number of, oh, sure, I think I can give you 10 subjects, and the traditional discounting that's done somewhat crystal ball by sponsors or CROs. I mean, I hope those days are behind us, and now it's much more like, here's the data that we have that demonstrates how we can perform and what the barriers are going to be, et cetera, right? And I think AI is an important tool because it can undo the analysis very quickly and in a more sophisticated way. But I do think, one of the questions we didn't get to, Dan, was about, is one of the barriers to taking the leap that I mentioned, one of sort of philosophy versus is it a data-driven decision? And I do think
Yeah.
it's more in the philosophical camp now. And Jim and I are actually working on a little side project to see if we can show, what was the performance of multi-site research corporation sites on a given trial versus those that aren't, because I think it's that kind of thing that will help move the needle when it comes to efficiency gains that I think you can get with multi-site research corporations.
Yeah, and I imagine that data is hard to find and hard to pull out of all those individual CTMS systems, right?
Yeah, we're trying.
Okay.
Right, Jim?
And
Yeah.
we deeply appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yes, addressing the research naive PI questions in here, not specifically related to MCRCs, but what are the best practices for research naive PIs to get trials awarded to them? How can they break through? Important given the demand that continues to outstrip the supply of PIs. I think we mentioned this in the beginning as one of these struggles, was one of the trends that we've seen happening here. Anybody have best practices for research naive PIs getting involved?
So as a research corporation, we have the constant need to be, as we grow, to add more PIs.
Mm-hmm.
And we hear our sponsors and CROs saying, we want more PIs, diverse PIs, et cetera. The challenge we have is there is no clear path that's consistent as an industry to a PI getting approved. And by the way, most PIs, the majority of them, are doctors. They know what it took to become a doctor. And you have doctors who are licensed, and now we get them to get hooked on research, right? We get their attention, we provide training, we bring them into the organization, even as sub-Is and so on and so forth. And many of them get very disenfranchised when they don't get approved. That they don't understand, and it's really difficult for us to say, well, let's give it another month. Let's see what else we can do training wise, et cetera. And so for us as an industry, that is an issue that if we don't pay attention today, it's going to catch up with us sooner rather than later. So we need to come together as an industry, and I'm looking not just Adam, Karen, and I. We can't solve that as an industry. We're going to need help from all the associations to help coalesce all of the players to what does it really take to at least have a little bit more visibility and granularity to how do I become a PI on a study?
Yeah, can I make a quick comment, Dan?
Yeah, sure.
I was at ACRP for 4 or 5 years, and that was one of the areas that we were really trying to focus on. ACRP is very focused on growing the clinical trial workforce, primarily PIs and study coordinators, but other roles as well. And it's interesting when you look at the FDA guidelines around, the PI, it says a qualified professional. What's qualified? What's qualified? And I think the way our default as an industry, our default is, well, if this is a doctor with a specialty in that particular therapeutic area, sure, they're qualified. And they are in terms of diagnosis and, standard of care and things of that nature. I think the issue comes in that clinical research is a completely different business model than clinical care.
Sure.
Now, there's some great activities going on in terms of clinical research as a care option, Krakow, those kinds of things. But I think a lot of physicians and a lot of healthcare professionals in general don't really understand what they're getting into when they get into clinical research, because it's not what they've been trained on as a clinician, if that makes sense. And I think
Yeah.
that's part of the challenge that we face as an industry, is we need better education on what clinical research is as people are learning about their career choices, et cetera, in healthcare.
Yeah, I totally agree, Jim and Carlos. I mean, it's a big catch-22, as I think you laid out, but both laid out. We won't select you as a PI until you've been a PI, and of course that sets you up. Well, you're never going to become a PI in order to qualify to become a PI. So,
Yeah.
I guess I do see the multi-site research corporations as a good option for physicians that are interested in getting into clinical research, right? Because they've got the scale again and the network of experienced investigators to provide that kind of mentorship and oversight. Because really, from my perspective, I'm fine giving someone a shot, right? But I'm less likely to do that if they're kind of isolated and on their own. And I would have some of the worries, Jim, that you said, that they really don't know what they're getting into. Well, I'm going to have more confidence that, if they're part of a larger structure, that there have been people that have told them the real deal of what it's going to take, and have the infrastructure to usher them along.
We're running out of time here. Let me ask one more question of the group here. What is one action each stakeholder, whether it be the MCRC, the CRO, sponsors, should take right away, tomorrow, to build better partnerships? What's one action? Karen, can we start with you?
Yep, sure, absolutely. And for me, it is all about that socializing what working with MCRCs really mean. So making sure that we continue with these spotlights, that we get the opportunity for the MCRCs to come and present to the relevant people in our company. We know the model works, and I think it's taking that leap of faith that Adam talked about earlier on. And so communication, socialization, and also sharing the great case studies that Carlos mentioned earlier.
Adam?
Yeah, I'll just echo what Karen said. I think it is taking that leap, and not just a leap transactionally, but I think taking the leap in that integrated way that both Jim and Carlos have mentioned. Like, pick a situation where it's a newer area to you and you've got a little bit more runway, and find out what the right multi-site research corporation is for you, and then start that relationship and have the interaction be more than just right on the doorstep of starting a trial. Like, build that relationship, incorporate the corporation into some of your protocol design and footprint decisions and things like that. I think that's where you're really going to see the upside come to fruition, is if you take that leap and start that early partnership engagement and really have that integrated approach.
Carlos?
I'd love to close it with both Karen's and Adam's comments. So socialize and partnership, right? For me, I would also add collaborate. Find, you develop that relationship, you socialize these examples of what's worked, what's not worked. But the word collaborate means tell us how we can help you. And Adam's alluded to some of those things, right? What can we provide for you? But also, I think it's important that we share openly with our partners, CROs and sponsors, what do we need to get out of it as well? We all have imperatives to achieve for our businesses, our programs. So I think that partnership, collaboration, and if you're uncomfortable to take the leap, as Adam said, right, a big leap, then start small. Identify a couple of small projects. Could be maybe lower priority projects as you get comfortable and get your organizations comfortable. So it's going to take some catalysts within every single organization to attract attention. And I know there's risk, but the reward is there. So please take the risk.
And
Jim,
I would
Go
add,
ahead.
Dan, that measure the results.
Yeah.
Conduct your operational clinical trial, if you will. And that is, look at your standard way of selecting sites and then get an MCRC involved. select one of those and look and see what the performance comparisons are. Look at the traditional site model versus working closely with an MCRC. And I think what you're going to find, and this is what we need data, I guess is what it comes down to. It's hard to convince clinical researchers to change their behavior without data.
Right.
And I admire that about clinical researchers. So let's measure performance.
Jim, do you want to take us home on this one? Is there anything else you want to say while we wrap this up?
Well, I'd like to thank the panelists again. This was really a fun discussion. You guys got my neurons firing here on a few ideas to come out of this. And hopefully we did the same for the participants, the audience, and everybody who dialed in and is listening. Thank you so much for taking the time today. We really appreciate it. And if we can do anything to help you, please reach out. And Dan, a special thanks to you as well. Thanks for moderating this. You did a great job, my friend.
Thank you all. Yeah.